Thank you very much. And the Subcommittee on National Parks, Forests, and Public Lands will come to order. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on the future of America's public lands. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at the hearing are limited to the chair and the ranking minority member or their designees. This will allow us to hear from our witnesses sooner and help members keep to their schedules. I ask unanimous consent that all of the members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. today or at the close of the hearing, whichever would come first. Hearing no objections, so ordered. Without objection, the chair might also declare a recess subject to the call of the chair. As described in the notice, statements and documents or motions must be submitted to the electronic repository at hnrc.mail.house.gov. Additionally, please note that as an in-person meeting, members are responsible for their own microphones. As with our in-person meetings, members may be muted by staff only to avoid inadvertent background noise. Finally, members or witnesses experience technical problems should inform committee staff immediately. Thank you for being here today for the first meeting of the 117th Congress of the Subcommittee on National Parks, Forests, and Public Lands. I want to welcome all our members, returning and new. As many of you know by now, our nation was struck again last night by a tragedy that is becoming all too frequent: mass gun violence. This most recent attack took place in Subcommittee Chair's Neguse's district, and even though he wanted to be here this morning, he is called to work more directly on behalf of his constituents. I will be submitting his full opening statement to the record, and my thoughts are with him, the families, and the loved ones of those impacted by yesterday's attacks. Though this is not in the jurisdiction of this committee, at a moment like this, I must implore that all my colleagues to consider the damage, the pain that these moments do cause. It is well past time we enact some common sense legislation to protect America from from these very mornings like today. As I said, I know this is a topic for another committee, another day, but I hope it is one we can all take seriously, which I know we do, and make an effort to come together on it. For this morning, we must press on to consider the important issues that are before us. This hearing is about stepping back for a moment to review the state of our public lands after the past 4 years and to consider how we might protect them for the future. As we face a changing climate, a loss of natural areas, it is imperative that we set a new path forward with robust investments, expanded protections, and support for our communities. I look forward to starting that work here today, and I want to thank all the witnesses for joining us here this morning. I look forward to hearing from the testimony. I want to extend to Chairman Neguse as I stated earlier, our condolences to him and his constituents. And also, as I was going to stroll in and listen to the witnesses today, I received a call that Mr. Neguse was either not going to be here or delayed, and I'm happy to do this in his behalf and with the committee and to listen to our witnesses today. With that, I'd like to recognize Ranking Member Fulcher.
Mr. Chairman, it's Congresswoman DeGette. Can I ask you to yield for just one moment?
Gentlelady's recognized. Yield to her.
Mr. Chairman, on behalf of the whole Colorado delegation, I want to thank you for your thoughts for Mr. Neguse and his district, and also for our whole state. This is obviously a terrible time for all of us, and you know, Columbine is in my district. We in Colorado here, we feel like we have had a disproportionate number of these terrible mass shootings. So I just want to thank you for being our chairman, for filling in, and I want to thank everybody for the thoughts that you've given to Mr. Neguse and to all of us. We all stand ready to help Joe in any way we can, and thanks for yielding to me. I yield back.
Thank you for those comments, Ms. DeGette, and thank you for pointing out that this is an effect on the state of Colorado and, quite frankly, on all of us. And so, thank you very much for that. With that, I'd like to recognize Ranking Member Fulcher for his opening remarks. Mr. Ranking Member, floor is yours.
Chairman Grijalva, thank you for filling in today, and allow me to add to the comments about what has transpired in Boulder. Send my personal deepest condolences to Chairman Neguse, to the Colorado delegation, to all those impacted by this. We're all grieving with you today, and our prayers and our thoughts are with each of you and as for this nation as we go through this loss. So please understand that this is serious for everyone. Today we meet to examine the future of America's public lands. It's my hope that the broad focus of today's hearing will give us an opportunity to consider the many challenges facing our national public lands and discuss wise, innovative solutions to those challenges. In Idaho and across the West, people depend on federal lands for their livelihoods, as well as recreation and enjoyment. No one understands this better than Idaho Governor Brad Little, who will be joining us later today. As a fourth-generation cattle and sheep rancher, he understands that those who make their living off the land are also some of the most actively involved in conservation, or they have a direct vested interest in sustainable management practices. Idaho's forest products industry is one of the many rich examples that illustrates the dual benefits of managing our lands to improve both the environment and our economy. Wise, active land management helps improve the health and resiliency of Idaho's national forests. Idaho's timber industry sustains over 31,000 jobs and provided $52 million in revenue for Idaho schools last year alone. Idaho is also a leader in using good neighbor authority to help manage our forests. Since 2016, planned and completed timber sales have treated over 17,000 acres of forest land, generated millions of dollars in economic activity, improved habitat for wildlife, and reduced the threat of wildfire. Regrettably, the committee has already advanced policies that will take us further away from those common sense, smart solutions to our land management issues. This hearing is coming nearly a full month after a significant package of bills, all fall under this subcommittee's jurisdiction, was sent to the House floor. That package of bills, which the administration claimed would promote the ambiguous and amorphous concept of 30 by 30, locked up 1.5 million acres of wilderness across the West and withdrew 1.2 million acres from mineral production, including critical minerals. If that is indicative of tomorrow's policy on public lands, the future is bleak. Policies like that ties the hands of our federal land managers, make it more difficult for rural communities to sustain their economies, and hurts the environment by making it more difficult to treat lands to make them resilient to threats of disease and catastrophic wildfire. I encourage my friends on the other side of the dais to commit to regular order going forward and truly listen to the members of Congress that represent large regions of federal land and allow us the opportunity to have input on these policies through the formal committee process. Unless we start really listening to local stakeholders, we're doomed to keep repeating the management mistakes of the past. Our public lands hold vast potential to benefit the American people, from abundant recreational opportunities to millions of jobs supported by the energy, mineral, timber, and grazing sectors. The question is, are we going to enact policies that fully recognize and enhance those multiple uses and the full potential of our lands? With that, I'm looking forward to hearing the testimony from our witnesses today. Yield back to the chairman. Thank you.
Gentleman yields, and the chair now recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Westerman, for your comments. Sir?
Thank you, Chairman Grijalva, and please allow me also to echo Congressman Fulcher's sentiments and sympathies to Chairman Neguse after yesterday's tragic events. He and his constituents are in my prayers. The focus of today's hearing, examining the future of America's public lands, is an appropriate one because ultimately our job is to make sure we are leaving a better, healthier environment for future generations. As the new ranking member of this, I believe that the best way we achieve that is by increasing access through innovation and conservation. When I say access, I don't mean just access to our lands for enjoyment or outdoor recreation. Access also needs to include access to our minerals to counter China's influence, access to timber supplies for rural jobs, and access to grazing allotments to support our ranchers. Unfortunately, instead of trying to increase access to our lands, our colleagues on the other side of the aisle are already trying to lock up millions of acres of land into new wilderness areas. Packages like the one that passed last month on the House floor not only decrease access to our lands, they kill jobs and actually hurt the environment. Arbitrary land lockups and onerous regulations that shut down rural economic activity restrict access and make it even more difficult to manage our severely fire-prone landscapes that are mostly not ingredients for building back better. That theme, which President Biden's campaign slogan and is now a series of hearings for the majority, has also included radical policies like the Green New Deal, which President Biden said was a crucial framework for meeting the climate challenges we face. The Building Back Better plan also embraces the 30 by 30 initiative, an ill-defined plan to protect 30% of America's lands and waters by 2030. 30 by 30 or 30 for 30 is a good name for a sports show on ESPN, but I'm not sure what it has to do with conservation. We're talking about millions of acres of land and hundreds of thousands of jobs for people who rely on multiple use and working lands. We owe them a lot better than a catchy tagline with no actual substance behind it. That's why Republicans on our committee are going to be focused on conservation, not preservation. We must pursue science-based, pro-growth solutions that will benefit our environment, our economy, and our country. It is critical as we move forward that we dispel the false narrative that in order for us to care for our climate and environment, we must embrace extremist and preservationist policies. I'm looking forward to hearing the debate today, and I'm especially looking forward to hearing from Idaho Governor Brad Little. Governor Little is a fourth-generation cattle and sheep rancher who understands better than anybody that those who live off the land are the best conservationists of the land. I want to thank all of our witnesses for being here, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank Ranking Member Fulcher and Westerner. Now I would like to turn to the witness panels. Let me remind our witnesses that under the committee rules, they must limit the oral statements to 5 minutes. Their entire statement will appear in the hearing record. When you begin, the timer will start and it will turn orange when you have 1 minute remaining, red when your time has expired. I recommend to members and to witnesses joining remotely to use the stage view so they can pin the timer on their screen. After your testimony is complete, please remember to mute yourself to avoid any inadvertent background noise, and I will also allow the entire panel to testify before questioning the witnesses. The chair now recognizes Ranking Member Fulcher for 30 seconds to introduce Governor Brad Little of Idaho. Mr. Fulcher, you recognize, sir?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I mentioned earlier in my opening statement today, we are joined by a governor from my home state of Idaho, Brad Little. Governor Little is not only a fourth-generation rancher, his family founded one of the largest off-road vehicle parks in America, the Little Gem Cycle Park. His testimony before the committee during the 115th Congress was extremely beneficial in understanding the importance of livestock grazing and the challenges facing rural America. And I have no doubt that his testimony today will be equally beneficial to the committee. With that, I'm proud to introduce my good friend and fellow Idahoan, Governor Little, and I'm sure that in the process he'll share that it was the person who succeeded him as the Idaho State Senate caucus chair that is responsible for all of his success. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Governor, welcome, and please, Governor, the time is yours, and you're recognized, sir, for your testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Grijalva and Congressman Fulcher, who did an admirable job of succeeding me in the Idaho Senate as caucus chairman. Committee members, but I too from Idaho want to extend our sincere condolences to the people of Colorado and Chairman Neguse's district. These kind of events make some of the other things we do in life pale in comparison. So the hearts and prayers of all of Idaho are with them. Besides being a rancher, I want to just talk briefly about the other hat I wore as a rancher before I got into public service. I had a long history representing my fellow ranchers and, in fact, people in Idaho and all over the West in working with both the commodity groups and conservation groups to sometimes successfully and sometimes unsuccessfully craft win-win scenarios for Western communities and conservation-minded people all over this country. Idaho's a massive Western state with about 2/3 of our land owned or managed by the federal government. With a relatively small population of 1.8 million, Idaho still in many areas feels like the Wild West. Only 2 other states have more designated wilderness areas where the most stringent environmental protections prevent any human activity other than by foot or by horse. The enormous amounts of designated wilderness in Idaho underscores the importance of keeping our remaining federal lands as working lands. Idaho is a mostly rural state. The majority of our communities rely on access via public lands for multiple uses, whether that be grazing, timber harvest, mining, outdoor recreation, and increasing tourism. These rural areas pay for fire management. They pay for roads and other essential functions. They simply cannot continue to do that without the ability to benefit in some way economically from the public lands. In addition, the recreating public depend on services provided by these rural communities. But Idaho is also the nation's fastest growing state. And as more and more people migrate here, the continued access to public lands for multiple use will become even more important. In Idaho, public lands are integral to our livelihoods, and we recognize we need to do all we can to keep these lands healthy for future generations. In most cases, conservation, not preservation, will achieve healthy public lands that provide a benefit and promote a high quality of life for our people for years to come. The no action approach generally does little more than incubate dangerous conditions, prevent active management, and harm rural economies. Conservation, on the other hand, embraces the role that communities play in managing the land so they can stay healthy for future generations. We have seen great success here in Idaho with diverse interests coming together to find common ground in conservation, public land management in many areas. We led the country in establishing Rangeland Fire Protection Association, where ranchers, like my sons, are trained and equipped to assist BLM in initial attack on fire. Idaho led the nation in launching the Good Neighbor Authority and Shared Stewardship, 2 initiatives that are improving the health of our forest and wildlife habitat, minimizing fire risk to communities, and creating jobs. Diverse interests came together in Idaho to agree on a plan to conserve sage grouse and their habitat, demonstrating grassroots approach. Conservation groups and the timber industry and many others came together to create Idaho's roadless rules to respond and manage 9 million acres of our national forests. It is important to note that in these instances, it was a partnership with us and the federal agencies to get these things done. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you, and I look forward to your questions of the subcommittee. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
You're welcome, sir, and thank you, Governor, for being with us today and taking the time. The chair now recognizes Dr. Molly Cross, Director of Climate Change Adaptation for North and South America for the Wildlife Conservation Society and Science Director of the WCS Climate Adaptation Fund. Dr. Cross, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. I also want to begin by expressing my condolences to the families impacted by the shooting yesterday in Boulder, Colorado. Quite a large number of my colleagues working in climate change research are based in Boulder, as well as many friends.
Do we have? Do we know?
And I'd like to extend my condolences to all of them. I'm here today to talk about climate change, but obviously it is just one of the major crises facing our world and country today. Let me begin by stating clearly that the scientific consensus is clear. The Earth's climate is changing, and human activities, including fossil fuel emissions and land conversion, are the reason. According to the congressionally mandated U.S. National Climate Assessment, The best available climate science anticipates increasing climate changes in the future here in the United States. And this poses significant risks to the values supported by US federal lands and waters, such as fish and wildlife populations, clean air and water, and a wide range of livelihoods. These values could literally go up in smoke with more severe wildfires, be drowned by rising seas, or wilt during hotter droughts brought about by a changing climate. The good news is there are actions we can take to reduce the amount of climate change the planet and our nation will experience, and to proactively prepare for climate risks in ways that can benefit both people and nature. These natural climate solutions are conservation, restoration, and improved land management practices that help to absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, what we call climate mitigation, as well as help nature and people prepare for the impacts of a changing climate, what we call climate adaptation. Sometimes these strategies can do both. Globally, protecting the world's intact forests is one of the most cost-effective natural climate solutions, and it is essential to stabilizing the climate for everyone on the planet. Therefore, the US government must support global policies and programs that protect intact forests and other carbon-rich ecosystems such as grasslands and coastal habitats. Here at home, the US government has an obviously even more direct role to play in the protection of intact ecosystems and the responsible management of natural resources with an eye towards climate mitigation and adaptation. There are a growing number of examples of natural climate solutions in action on public and private lands and waters in the US. Through the Climate Adaptation Fund, we at WCS have invested over $22 million in over 110 projects in the US that are helping wildlife and ecosystems and the people that depend on them adapt to a changing climate. During the Q&A, I'd be happy to share examples of projects taking place in your home states or addressing climate impacts of concern to your constituents. Despite these many inspiring examples, in order to meet the scope and scale of the climate crisis, the US government must accelerate and expand science-based investments in the protection and responsible stewardship of our federal lands and waters. However, the US government cannot fight the challenges of climate change alone. Increased federal leadership, funding, and technical support to state and local governments, to tribes, to private landowners, and many others are also essential to address the climate crisis. Therefore, I urge the US government to invest more heavily in the future of America's public and private lands in three key ways. First, by meeting bold targets for conservation, including protecting at least 30% of US lands and waters by 2030 in ways that are science-based, equitable, and that acknowledge the important contributions of private and working lands. Second, by increasing investment in Indigenous-led conservation and climate adaptation efforts. Indigenous peoples bring irreplaceable perspectives and knowledge relevant to climate adaptation, in part because they've been adapting to change for millennia and in their ways of honoring and respecting the animals, plants, lands, and waters around us. We need to continue to support their ability to deal with climate change challenges of today. And third, finally, by increasing funding and technical capacity for climate-informed management planning and action within federal agencies and with non-federal partners. Now is the time to act. And I acknowledge it won't always be easy and there'll be difficult transitions to navigate. But if we apply American ingenuity and greater investment by the US government towards natural climate solutions, we can build back better and make a difference for our climate, for biodiversity, and for human well-being. We cannot afford not to. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you today. I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
The chair will now recognize Ms. Sharon Buccino, adjunct professor at Wyoming College of Law and senior director of the Land Division with the Natural Resources Defense Council. Ms. Buccino, 5 minutes a year, you're recognized.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Thank you. My name is Sharon Buccino. I teach at the University of Wyoming as well as work as an attorney at the Natural Resources Defense Council. My remarks represent the views of NRDC. They do not represent the views of the University of Wyoming. I'm speaking, the views are my own. Current times demand new legal mechanisms for managing America's public lands. We need to integrate decision-making across ownership and jurisdictional lines. We need to collect, organize, and deploy information so that we can quickly adjust our decisions as circumstances change. We need to include voices of those who have been denied a meaningful role in the management of our public lands, the voices of Indigenous and other people of color. A new comprehensive legal framework for public land management could help, and Congress should work on this. But plenty can be done now to move us in the right direction in the meantime, within the existing statutory framework provided by the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, the National Forest Management Act, and the National Environmental Policy Act. These laws speak to sustainability and the need to address long-term needs. Even lands managed for multiple use cannot be used in ways that deny their benefits to future generations. FLPMA defines multiple use as harmonious and coordinated management of various resources without permanent impairment of the productivity of the land and the quality of the environment. Congress required that the Bureau of Land Management weigh long-term benefits to the public against short-term benefits. Any consideration of long-term benefits requires us to manage our federal fossil fuels differently going forward than we have in the past. We must manage them in a way that solves catastrophic climate change rather than fuels it. Our public land laws not only authorize but demand a moratorium on new fossil fuel leases. Looking at the Mineral Leasing Act, it authorizes the Secretary of the Interior to lease oil, gas, and coal in her discretion. It does not require leasing. Continued leasing of federal fossil fuels harms future generations. Science tells us this, but so are youth across the nation. It is time we listen and act. We must also do a better job informing decisions. This won't happen unless we give federal land management agencies the staff and resources to complete the stewardship that we expect of them. Finally, we must find ways to include the voices that have previously been left out of managing our public lands. As designated by President Obama in 2016, Bears Ears National Monument provided a powerful example of how to do this. His proclamation established an intertribal Bears Ears Commission to guide the management of the monument. Congress should support the immediate reestablishment of the commission and provide the resources it needs to help steward these lands in the way they deserve. The Biden administration's initiative to protect 30% of the nation's lands and waters by 2030 offers a tremendous opportunity to achieve some of the changes we need. Such action is a concrete step toward what a growing consensus of scientists say we must do. We are destroying the natural systems upon which all life depends. There is something in 30 by 30 for everyone. It's not just about wilderness. It's not one size fits all. The task is too big. We need private landowners, local governments, states, and tribes to be part of the necessary conservation gains. Building back better requires natural infrastructure, not simply concrete or steel. To end, I'll come back to where I started, a vision of an equitable and vibrant future for all. Our nation's public lands can play a critical role in such a future, but we can't take them for granted. We must act now to ensure that their benefits are here tomorrow as well as today. Thank you for your consideration of these important issues and for the opportunity to participate in this hearing. I will be happy to answer questions.
And now let me recognize Ms. Mary Ellen Sprinkle, President and CEO of the Chorus Network. You're recognized.
Member Fisher, and members of the subcommittee. Good morning and thank you for holding today's hearing, Building Back Better on Public Lands, and for the opportunity to share how Service and Conservation Corps can and should be part of that effort. My name is Mary Ellen Sprinkle. I'm the President and CEO of the Corps Network, which is the National Association of Service and Conservation Corps. The Corps Network represents more than 130 organizations or corps. Based on the Civilian Conservation Corps of the 1930s, today's corps provide young adults with opportunities to advance their education, obtain essential workforce skills, and gain hands-on work experience through conservation service projects in communities and on public lands across the country. Today's corps are diverse and versatile and reflect the needs of the communities in which they serve. In rural areas, corps partner with land management agencies to build and maintain trails, campgrounds, and other outdoor recreation facilities, restore and protect habitat and waterways, and remove invasive species and hazardous fuels, while interns provide visitor services and agency support. In urban areas, corps create parks, playgrounds, and urban gardens. They install green infrastructure, including solar panels, energy-efficient heating and cooling systems, and permeable surfaces. And many corps across the country respond to disasters, including the current pandemic. Collectively, these corps engage nearly 25,000 young adults annually. Corps members, like the communities they serve, are diverse. In 2019, 46% of corps members identified as female and 44% identified as persons of color. Corps members come from rural and urban communities around the country and from across the spectrum of education level and economic status. Nearly a century ago, the United States faced several crises at the same time: the Great Depression, high unemployment, and widespread poverty, as well as environmental issues like drought, erosion, and wildfire. In response, President Roosevelt established a Civilian Conservation Corps. The result was a generation of young men prepared to serve their country in World War II, create one of the strongest economies in our nation's history, and build infrastructure and public land systems that are still in use. Today, the unemployment rate for young adults is 10% and much higher for young adults of color. Deferred maintenance on our public lands is in the billions, and communities across the country are ill-prepared for the impacts of climate change. It is no surprise then that Americans are calling for a modern-day CCC and that President Biden has proposed the establishment of a Civilian Climate Corps as part of his Build Back Better plan. Fortunately, we don't have to start from scratch. Based on the infrastructure and expertise of existing corps, with additional investments in project work, workforce development, and corps member support, today's corps could double or even triple in a short period of time and provide the foundation for this effort. It worked in the 1930s, and it worked again in 2009 through the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. ERA funding resulted in $60 million in new project work and approximately 10,000 additional corps members for existing corps. It also allowed corps to develop new program models like Veterans Fire Corps and the Ancestral Lands Program. Today, we can look at the CCC and ERA to see what worked well and where there could be improvements. For example, the CCC enrolled primarily white men. Today, we know that women and people of color bring enormous benefit to the corps and communities in which they serve. And despite ERA's many successes, we know that the majority of new funding went to large-scale, multi-million-dollar projects done by large contractors. More Americans could have benefited from smaller but equally important projects completed by local workers. And more Americans could have benefited from an increased investment in workforce development programming and greater utilization of the Public Lands Corps Hiring Authority. We also know from hindsight that the matching requirement and time-bound project agreements prevented significant and lasting growth at many corps. All of these issues, however, could be addressed in a future economic stimulus package or Civilian Climate Corps. Therefore, as the subcommittee discusses important benefits of including public lands in the economic recovery package, the Corps Network urges you to consider the following: funding not only for federal public lands and waters, but also for similar projects at the state and local level. A set aside for appropriate projects for service and conservation corps with a priority on currently underserved communities and populations. An increased investment in workforce development, in addition to increased funding for project work, greater utilization of the PLC hiring authority, longer-term agreements and a streamlined approval process, and a waiver or reduction of the 25% matching requirement on PLC projects. In closing, the Corps Network recommends that the subcommittee commends the subcommittee for considering the important role that public lands can play in economic recovery and job creation, and we urge you to consider the inclusion of provisions that would broaden and lengthen the impact of such a stimulus package, while at the same time develop the next, more diverse generation of resource managers, outdoor enthusiasts, and environmental stewards. Thank you for your time, and I will answer any questions.
Thank you very much, and I want to thank all the witnesses for their valuable testimony, and let me remind the members, D imposes a 5-minute limit on questions. The chair will recognize any members for any questions they may wish to ask the witnesses. Let me now recognize myself for 5 minutes. One of the, if I may, Dr. Cross, in your written testimony, you talk about the climate-informed management planning. That's a section in your testimony. How can Congress help the federal land agencies transition to this climate-informed management approach? When that kind of begs the question about some level of uniformity in terms of going forward. Any response to that?
Yeah,
Dr. Cross?
thank you. Yeah, thank you, Chairman Grijalva, for that question. So when I talk about climate-informed management, planning, and action, I'm talking about how we need to look closely at our management approaches, because in many ways, climate change could undermine some of the actions we take right now to try to manage public lands. And so we need to look ahead to the impacts of a changing climate and how changes in climate could impact the effectiveness of our, let's say, riparian planting projects, or looking at our stream restoration projects, thinking about how we try to enable fish passage to support fish populations. As we have bigger floods or as the climate changes, those projects need to be looked at through the lens of a changing climate. And there are lots of different resources for accessing climate projections that help you think about what the future climate might be and how it could impact ecological systems that we're managing. And there are tools and resources to help managers sort of incorporate that climate information into the design of management projects. Because the reality is, if we keep doing things the way we've always been doing while the climate changes around us, we run the risk of making investments in land management that are no longer effective. So when I talk about that, it's about supporting the development of science research that can support and inform management planning, tools and resources to help managers apply that information in their work. And then, of course, making sure federal agencies have the staffing and capacity to be able to put actions on the ground.
Thank you. Can I be heard?
Yep.
Okay, good. Let me ask Ms. Pacino. I think former Secretary Bernhardt appeared before this committee and told us that in his opinion, Congress has not required the Department of Interior to address climate change in the management of our lands and waters. Besides asking if you agree or disagree with that, I think let's just talk about some examples of the Department of Interior's responsibility to consider and respond to climate change in the agency land management portion of it, in that responsibility, if you wouldn't mind, because you know that has been brought up before, that there's no clear direction. Well, I think the question is, what about that responsibility for the Department of Interior? If you don't mind, Ms. Pacino.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do not agree with the position that former Secretary Bernhardt articulated. In fact, what Dr. Cross just articulated we need to do inform our decisions based on climate change is exactly what the law does require. I'm specifically referring to the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. The Department of Interior is responsible to climate change. It's a reality, and we're feeling its consequences now, and they're just going to get worse. And the courts have been clear that NEPA does require Interior to evaluate these impacts. Just one example is including greenhouse gas emissions, addressing the impacts of those greenhouse gas emissions that result from burning oil, gas, and coal that the Department of Interior leases. And this highlights the critical need of the Biden administration also to take explicit action to reverse the damaging changes that were made to the rules that the Council of Environmental Quality uses and has used for over 40 years to implement the National Environmental Policy Act.
Yeah, we join with you in those observations and to some extent some recommendations that have been forwarded to the White House relative to the points that you just brought up, that they're very important. Some level of uniformity, a look at BLM and kind of the provincial policies across the country as opposed to one overarching mandate for that agency. And so thank you. I think that the precedent is there. Ms. Branco, if I may, I'm going to indulge 30 seconds. I have no questions, but I do want to thank you for the work. I'm happy to join Mr. Neguse, Chairman Neguse, in introducing the 21st Century Conservation Corps Act that, along with Senator Wyden in the Senate, that responds to President Biden's core commitment. And so thank you for that. And with that, let me now turn to ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Westerman, if he has any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses for your testimony today. My first question is for Governor Little. And, you know, we've seen these misguided preservationist policies that, you know, favor onerous regulations and land lockups versus true conservation, where we have multiple use and wise management of our public lands. And you brought that out in your testimony, Governor. Can you think of, or can you describe the benefits of true conservation versus preservationist policies to land in Idaho?
Well, Congressman Westerman, we in Idaho have multiple examples of where conservation-minded Idahoans, people that, you know, Trout Unlimited, Nature Conservancy, local environmental groups, have all sat down with local communities, whether it be on sage grouse, whether it be on timber management. One of the issues is you know, I understand the change in climate. What we have to do is scale up our management. We are not meeting the call for what we need to do. The states that have had these catastrophic wildfires, there is a complete agreement. 90% of Idahoans agree that we have to have more active management, whether it's controlled burning that's taking place outside in Idaho today, or whether it's really good management, creating a little cash for a local collaborative to do everything from passage for fish to road renovation. There is an opportunity with the program's shared stewardship and Good Neighbor Authority to scale up the management we need on these on the vast majority of our multiple use lands. And some of these well-intended proposals exacerbate that progress, and that's what we in Idaho want to do. We want to scale up together the management of those lands so that the negative effect of these catastrophic wildfires is mitigated.
Yeah, and I know this new 30 by 30 initiative, and there's not really any details out on it, but you mentioned that 9% of Idaho is already locked up in wilderness area. What would that do to your state to lock up an additional 21% in wilderness area? What kind of impact would that have? And go ahead.
I think beauty is in the eye of the beholder. You know, you can change the management prescription on a landscape and not lock it up, but you have to recognize that we Homo sapiens have had we build roads, we manage waterways, we drive cars, and we will continue to drive cars. Even if they're all electric cars, you still have to put fossil fuel inputs or some kind of fuel inputs into them. You have got to take action to mitigate effects of what we have. Industry is doing that. A lot of it's being done by finance. Our largest utility in Idaho is going to be all, and they're going to make a conversion over to a less carbon portfolio. But even if you go to the carbon portfolio in my neighboring states, there is all kinds of technology there to mitigate, whether it be methane, whether it be carbon, whether it be sequestration. I just think we're at a fork in the road now, and we ought to take the fork of innovation rather than conservation biology and just throw up our hands and not do anything.
Yeah, I would agree with that, that we have an opportunity to make a real difference here. I've always said that, the choice not to manage is a management choice, especially when we're talking about forests. And Ms. Bashino, I know that you were talking about Colorado, and I believe in your testimony you're promoting the idea of locking up our oil and gas, managing it that way. But the data I've seen shows that the forests in Colorado are emitting more carbon than they're capturing, that you're actually losing forests, and you would probably say that's due to climate change. But should we not be managing those in light of climate change and drier conditions?
Yes, so I am not opposed, and NRDC is not opposed to more active management of the public lands, but it needs to be informed by facts. And we're also not opposed to partnerships. It's absolutely critical to have the state and local governments and organizations working with the federal government. And a good example of such partnership was the effort around sage grouse that the governors of Colorado and Wyoming led a task force over several years to develop plans to prioritize. It wasn't eliminating oil and gas leasing, but it was prioritizing those leases outside of areas of prime sage grouse habitat. And unfortunately, the last administration wiped that all away. And as all of the witnesses have said, we need to work together rather than resulting in this whiplash and this policy pendulum of doing one thing in one administration and exactly the opposite in the next. That's not efficient or effective for anybody.
Thank you very much. And let me now recognize Vice Chair Insular Affairs for the full committee, Mr. Sablan, for your 5 minutes. Mr. Sablan? Am I on? Thank you. Is Mr. Sablan? Mr. Sablan? Mr. Sablan is not available. Let me now turn to Ms. DeGette for her 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And I just want to thank you for your leadership in helping us pass H.R. 803, the Protecting America's Wilderness and Public Lands Act, earlier this Congress. And I look forward to continuing to work with you and all the other members of this subcommittee as that goes to that huge lands package goes to the Senate for passage. It was really a bold statement for the beginning of this 117th Congress. And I'm looking forward to working with you and also everybody on this subcommittee on how we can protect our great public lands around this country. And I would like to talk to you, Dr. Cross, for a minute. I wanted to talk with you about the conservation measures across the landscape that you had referred to in your testimony. And I also want to thank you for all of your leadership. We you talk about the 30 by 30 effort, but as the governor noted, and Governor Welcome, all lands are not wilderness lands, and I surely agree with that, and I think you do as well. So for the 30 by 30 goal, we're not talking about locking up 30% of our federal lands. We're talking about making some of our lands, a very low number of the total federal lands, wilderness as appropriate. But then for the rest of those lands, many of them will have multiple use, and that's appropriate. What you're talking about is making sure that they're managed in a way that is targeted at protecting the climate. Is that correct?
That is absolutely correct. I think that we are talking about preservation and conservation. We can do both. There will be some places where protection of a stricter level will be necessary and appropriate to guard especially important resources and biodiversity. But we also, to achieve at least 30% of protection of US public lands and waters in the United States, it will definitely involve incentivizing and supporting conservation measures on private lands, on working lands, on tribal lands, and acknowledging the very important role that those lands play in contributing to conservation outcomes.
Well, and that I was also a little perplexed when the ranking member kept talking about conservation versus preservation, because I think you can do both. I think you can preserve appropriate lands, and you can also work on conservation efforts. And something I'll note, and perhaps you know about this, is that like in the PAW Plus Act, the areas of wilderness that are in my bill, almost all of them have been designated as wilderness study areas for 40 years now. So it's not like we're doing something different. We're just thinking about land management in ways that can protect the climate. Is that your understanding as well?
Yes, absolutely. It's about taking, a science-based look at how we manage our lands in ways that can provide the wide range of values that we hold for our public lands, in addition to trying to support as much climate adaptation, mitigation, and biodiversity conservation as possible.
And let me ask you this, because I think there's a false narrative. I keep hearing it, that you can either protect public lands or have job creation. Can you do both? Can you both protect the public lands and make that a job creator? And can you explain how that can happen?
Yeah, absolutely. In order to do sort of land management at the scope and scale that we're talking about for conservation goals, for climate adaptation and mitigation goals, will take a lot of boots on the ground and has an enormous opportunity to create jobs in these fields, as well as in scientific fields, to bring that science-based approach to our land management.
And also, at least in Colorado, outdoor recreation creates jobs right there near the public lands. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Our public lands are a major economic driver because of the natural resources that they protect and conserve for the enjoyment of all people.
And one last question for you. One thing I've always felt, and this is, I think this can be bipartisan, in order to protect our public lands the way we need to, we've got to greatly emphasize fully funding the land management agencies like the BLM and the Forest Service. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. When we've done climate-informed planning, some of the biggest hurdles are not about having access to the science or knowing what to do. It's about having the capacity within the agencies to actually get out and do the actions that they know are important.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And again, I appreciate everybody's thoughts and concerns about Boulder. I yield back.
Thank you. Gentlelady yields back. Mr. Ranking Member Subcommittee, Mr. Fulcher, you're recognized for 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just a reminder to my colleagues, in our state, or my home state of Idaho, we already have about 63% of our land mass is federal. So as we talk about things like 30 for 30, it's important to note that a lot of that is significantly hindered now in terms of the access to wise management practices. But I have a question for Governor Little. Under your leadership, Governor, Idaho has led the country in utilizing the Good Neighbor Authority to increase forest and watershed health and decrease the risk of catastrophic wildfires. While the Farm Bill provided counties and tribes with the authority to use the Good Neighbor Authority, A drafting error prevented the usage of the same funding structure that states can utilize. Last Congress, Senator Risch and I introduced legislation to fix the funding structure. Governor, can you speak to the success of the Good Neighbor Authority program and how changing the funding structure would assist counties and tribes?
Well, Mr. Chairman and Congressman Fulcher, thank you. What we need to do is scale it up. We need to scale up what we're doing in the area of active management. As the congressman pointed out to the committee, 63% is federal, but we have nearly 15 million acres in either roadless area or current wilderness area. We've got plenty of set-aside land. In fact, I would advocate that some of it needs a higher degree of management that's allowed under particularly the Wilderness Act. But if we can't manage that ground, some of the negative consequences flow on to multiple use ground, private ground, flows down the Columbia River into Oregon and Washington, impacts anadromous fish. But Congressman, to scale up Good Neighbor Authority, I appreciate you giving me the credit for it, but in essence, it was the current Secretary of the Department of Agriculture and the Western Governors Association, and in fact, everybody involved in Idaho, a lot of the conservation groups that put together GNA and shared stewardship. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And as a follow-up to that, Governor, Idaho's forest products industry, as you know, contributes millions of dollars to the state's schools. And there's thousands of people that are employed as a function of that. And it's vital to our state's economy. What would it mean to our rural communities and jobs if we stop practices that allowed the forest to be working for us?
Well, Mr. Chairman and Congressman Fulcher, I just had a phone call a couple days ago with all the forest supervisors. We have 2 regions in Idaho, and a lot of the fundamental underpinnings of both shared stewardship and Good Neighbor Authority is to minimize the negative impacts of NEPA on getting things done. We have found, and the Forest Service and the conservation groups agree, that some of the hurdles we have in NEPA, and they were not in the original NEPA bill, a lot of it is interpretation, court cases, et cetera, have just been an impediment to scaling up active management. And it's a transparent process. People can look and see what that is. And anything we can do to scale up the current management with our partners in the Forest Service, we have people that have worked in these collaboratives for decades trying to resolve habitat problems, landscape problems that are out there. And we don't need any big change. What we need to do is scale that up to have more management. And so those good jobs in those communities, those good timber jobs, and no respect to my friends in the hospitality industry, but believe me, those jobs in the wood products, whether they're working in the woods or whether they're working in a modern processing facility, those are the jobs that pay for schools, that pay for healthcare, that sustain those local communities, so that we've got an infrastructure there. When people from out of state want to come enjoy that public land, that infrastructure is paid for by the timber industry, and that's why it's so important we scale it up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Governor, I think I'm just about out of time on my side. I just want to thank you again for your involvement in the active, wise management of lands process, and encourage my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to try to take a look at the policies we've been engaging with in Idaho. I think there's a lot of good to be said there. Thank you for your help. Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Gentleman yields. Let me attempt to recognize Mr. Sablan again. Sablan? If not, let me now recognize Mr. Tonko for 5 minutes, sir. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for holding today's hearing. Our public lands, including national parks and wilderness areas, play an important role as we work to advance climate solutions. And science-based management of our public lands and resources is a critical component, I believe, of this important work. So, Dr. Cross, as a scientist, can you shed some light on some of the impacts you have seen in the past 4 years to scientists and science-based decision-making when it comes to protecting the climate and our public lands?
Absolutely. Obviously, I am not a federal scientist myself, but I work on a daily basis with federal scientists. I also happen to be married to one. So I know firsthand what some of the challenges have been over the last 4 years, including sort of dragging their feet on spending congressionally authorized funding to support a wide range of science-based research, including on climate change, as well as stifling or limiting communications and failing to promote and discuss and communicate about the important work that has been done by federal scientists over the last several years. Again, very specifically around climate change, but also many other scientific areas of research, which serves to undermine trust with partners. It serves to, what the public doesn't know, it's, read about, they don't know, and they don't know what the important role is that federal scientists are playing on a wide range of issues. And what the public doesn't know about, they aren't going to support. So it's led to, I would say, a real erosion of both morale as well as influence of the important work that's being done by federal scientists.
Thank you. And Dr. Cross, how can Congress help ensure that we return to science-based decision-making in land management?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think investing in the science agencies, obviously within the federal government, enabling them to do the science that they know how to do and to support managers the way they know how to support managers. Programs like the Climate Adaptation Science Centers are especially important when it comes to preparing federal land management for a changing climate. They provide science, cutting edge climate science, and tools and resources for applying that science into management, and are a really critical way that one of many federal programs that help to get climate science onto the ground and help support managers.
Okay, and if I could ask you also to explain why President Biden, if you do know the rationale, has chosen to protect 30% of our lands and waters by 2030. What is the science-based decision-making here as it relates to that number?
Mm-hmm. There is the focus on 30% is driven by sort of a very wide political base of support and scientific support for that being sort of at least what we need to do in order to stem the tide of biodiversity loss and sort of runaway climate change that's underway today. So there's a significant scientific base that suggests that at least 30% of our lands and waters need to be protected or conserved in some manner. And again, I want to emphasize that we are not talking about locking land away. There may be times and places where protection of a strict level is important, but the majority of our contributions and ability to achieve these goals are going to take place on working lands. And I think there are great opportunities for doing so.
And you mentioned the role of USGS climate adaptation centers in your testimony. Can you briefly elaborate on the role these centers play in climate-informed land management?
Yeah, thank you, Representative. I'd be happy to. So it is, I think, a really fantastic way that we see collaboration happening between federal agencies, federal funding sources, non-governmental organizations, including my own, and other non-federal partners like state fish and wildlife agencies. I ran a project this last year with federal funding from the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center to work very closely with the Wyoming Game and Fish Department to help them proactively plan for the impacts of a changing climate in their statewide habitat plan. So now not only do they have an innovative climate-informed plan, it's really set them on a path to making better decisions that are going to be more effective in the long run given a changing climate. So a really great way that these centers help to support cutting-edge climate science and supporting both federal and non-federal agencies in climate-informed management planning.
Thank you. And Ms. Puccino, as you noted in your testimony, agency staffing and capacity diminished under the previous administration, but this trend isn't new. How does loss of career agency staff impact projects on the ground, from scientific studies to infrastructure projects and agency planning?
Well, without the staff and without the resources, the agencies can't do the job of stewardship that we expect of them and that the law requires them to do. Just a couple quick examples. It takes resources to do effective outreach, to incorporate the diverse views of various local interests, to bring the counties in, to bring different local voices into decision making. That's at the front end. And then at the back end, it takes resources and staff to do the monitoring that's absolutely necessary to see if the decisions that are made are having the results that are intended and to change and to respond when they aren't.
Thank you so much. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, sir. The chair now recognizes Mr. Tiffany for 5 minutes. You're recognized, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first, I would like to address Ms. Vicino. You used the term coordination or coordinated, and I see in your written testimony you also cited cooperation. Do you see a difference between those terms, cooperation and coordination, in a legal sense?
Well, I'm not sure there's really much difference in the legal sense. I think we don't have enough of either one. And as I mentioned, partnerships are critically important. And we also heard earlier that it's critically important that 30 by 30 is more than a slogan. I believe it is more than a slogan, and we need more than a slogan.
So, Ms. Vicino, thank you very much for that. You don't see much difference there. I actually believe there's a significant difference in how the word is used in federal law. Coordination means to work hand in hand with an equal seat at the table for local and state elected officials, whether they're county, the governor, as in the instance of Idaho. I think coordination has a very specific meaning when it comes to federal law. And I'm hopeful that our federal agencies will adopt coordination, that they give everyone an equal seat at the table, which I believe is what coordination means. Second question, in regards to the Keystone Pipeline, which was stopped on January 20th by President Biden, you said Indigenous people's voices should be heard. There are Indigenous tribes in Canada who decried the decision by the Biden administration. Should we be listening to those Indigenous peoples also?
Well, let me first respond to your point on coordination and refer you to cooperating agencies under the National Environmental Policy Act is an important
Be brief,
way.
Ms. Vicino. I have 5 minutes.
Okay, sure. And it has to happen within the frame of our federal laws. And the cooperation of states is critical, but there are federal mandates that ensure a common standard of protection and common approaches across the country. In terms of Keystone, we have been working with Indigenous voices within this country across the board. Those are the wisdom and experience of those who have been on the land for generations is critical to making wise decisions for all of us.
Yeah, the Indigenous tribes in Canada really decried this because it jeopardized them of proper management up in Canada of natural resources, as well as taking that revenue in. Governor Little, is the environment in the state of Idaho in worse shape than 4 years ago? Are you there, Governor Little?
I'm still on Zoom 101, Mr. Chairman. I apologize. And Congressman, no, we're making progress. We're just not making it at the rate we need to. We know that the management practices at the rate they're going right now are not going to be satisfactory to keep the threat down. So we just need to amp up. But our water's cleaner, our air's cleaner. The net of our energy portfolio in the state, whether it be carbon, is better. The advancement we're making on the environment in Idaho, the only issue we have in Idaho is our we're the fastest growing state, and we're having a little bit of a problem managing the population growth. But what we need is better management on the public lands, because it's great magnet for people to move.
So Governor Little, the environment is actually in better shape than 4 years ago in Idaho.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's terrific to hear. And by the way, it is very interesting because we see the same thing when I live in a rural area in northern Wisconsin, where those people that want to change how we go about management, where we've been doing proper management for decades, they come in and say, now you've got to change the very thing that they're coming to visit. It is very interesting to watch that. One more quick question for Ms. Bacino. With the Natural Resources Defense Council, China is one of the greatest threats in regards to global environment and cleaning up our environment globally. Does the NRDC take any money from foreign interests, including China?
No, we do not.
You do not. Do you have your books open to that? I mean, can we see who your funders are? Because there's word that some environmental organizations are taking money from Russia, Chinese, and even Saudi Arabian interests.
We practice the transparent accounting that's required of nonprofits and that we expect of the federal government as well.
Okay, thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman. I believe my 5 minutes are up.
Thank you. Gentleman yields. Let me recognize Ms. Talib for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, sir. You know, one of the things that I want to try to do is break down this myth that the environmental protection policies and agenda and trying to really protect our lands is in conflict with economic well-being, and how we need to emphasize how responsible environmental stewardship and investment can, in fact, be able to create jobs that especially benefit frontline communities like mine. Programs like Greening of Detroit's Green Corps and Detroit's Conservation Corps provide youth and adults in my district with practical job skills and training that also benefits the environment. In that vein, I ask unanimous consent, Chairman, to submit for the record a Greening Youth Foundation's testimony about the need for diversity in environmental job training.
So ordered. Thank you.
When we do talk about the Green New Deal, it's almost as much a jobs program as it is an environmental agenda. And we need to achieve a revolutionary shift in how we produce energy in our country, but we can do it in a way that also gives economic opportunity to historically disadvantaged communities like mine. If our environment and public lands are to be managed for the survival and enjoyment of all people, then it must be managed by all people whose diverse experiences and perspectives are vitally important. So, Ms. Sprinkle, especially in the midst of the economic crisis the pandemic has created, why is it important for youth and people of color to have opportunities within the core network?
As we think about making a shift to a cleaner, sustainable economy, it's important that the people who have suffered the brunt of environmental injustice and investment have an opportunity to be at the forefront of these opportunities. As you mentioned, Greening Youth Foundation and a number of our corps specifically engage young people of color, young people who have multiple barriers to employment, to make sure that they are at the front of the line when these opportunities become available, and that as good jobs develop and career pathways, that they look more like America.
Absolutely. And I think when a lot of people think about Conservation Corps, they think about the New Deal, building trails and parks. By increasing these environmental job training programs, are taking on new purposes. And also, so Ms. Springer, can you talk about some of the types of Job Corps can prepare people for beyond the classic image of trail building in the wilderness?
Sure. Well, as we transition to a cleaner and sustainable economy, I think cities, urban areas will need to do retrofitting and weatherization of low-income housing, permeable surfaces, transition to alternative sources of energy and transportation. And I think that there's a tremendous amount of job growth there. Producing food within the community, sustainable agriculture, is another area that could potentially be developed.
I mean, manufacturing opportunities. I just see so much even in the sciences. You know, Mr. Chairman, some of my residents live in places that are referred to as sacrifice zones. I don't know if any of my colleagues are aware of that, where generations of families in my district have been subjected to decades of pollution, environmental destruction. Some have saw so many high rates of asthma and cancer within their families. Many are forced to take jobs with the same polluters themselves, these corporate polluters, because of the lack of opportunity. This is precisely the people who should have the first opportunity to take advantage of green jobs. And we need to ensure these green jobs and Conservation Corps around the country have the funding they need to deliver these transformational change. So I hope my colleagues are open-minded and understanding that. And again, I always offer any of you to come to Detroit and to take what I call the toxic tour in one of the most polluted zip codes in the country. With that, I yield and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this hearing.
Thank you for your comments and questions. Mr. Lieb, let me now turn to Mr. Gomer. You're recognized for 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses. The Green New Deal, I can assure you, in Texas, it is a jobs bill, and it's already deprived tens of thousands of jobs, which will continue. But I'm curious, Dr. Cross, do you know, is Delaware going to lose 30% of its private real property, or is this a Biden administration plan that is applied to thee but not to him?
I mean, my understanding is the goal is to protect at least 30% of all U.S. lands and waters by 2030. And that is not by locking away private lands away from private hands.
Okay, so you don't know about Delaware. Thank you. That was my question. I doubt that Delaware is going to allow 30% of its land to be taken as public. And as far as locking it away, I've got counties that have lost a great deal of land. It was under the program, the National Forest Program, that assured that counties, to make up for the tremendous loss in revenue, would get 25% of the revenue off the forest. We don't have redwoods, we don't have sequoias, they're pine trees, and they grow to replacement 20 to 25 years later. But let me ask the governor. Governor, are you familiar with whether or not new trees sequester more carbon or older trees?
Well, Mr. Chairman and Congressman, obviously, the faster they're growing, the more carbon they're sequestering. And of course, if you take a tree and harvest the tree and put it in your house, that carbon, unless your house burns down, is sequestered forever. So we know that and there's a lot of science evolving about sequestration. We just know that things that are better managed sequester more carbon than particularly wildfires. You look at big catastrophic wildfires, and not only the amount of carbon, but the amount of mercury and other pollutants that are put into the air, that, our goal in Idaho through shared stewardship with all our partners is to minimize these big fires. There's the big carbon event of those big catastrophic fires. Thank you, Congressman and Mr. Chairman.
Well, what I've seen in Idaho indicates that your state forestry people understand fire breaks and managing the forest by getting rid of the underbrush so that wildlife can flourish there. It's pretty well understood by the state officials, but runs into trouble sometimes with the federal officials. Is that what you've seen?
Well, Mr. Chairman and Congressman, last year, our Idaho Department of Lands planted 2.3 million seedlings in Idaho. But I will tell you that our Forest Service partners and the conservation community, they agree. They agree that we've got to have better management. the biggest impediment to us are kind of fruitless NEPA challenges to the work we need to get done. If you did a poll of the people of Idaho about having more active management on what we call the roaded front or the managed public lands, it would be almost unanimous. We have to have more management. And yes, we want to have good young growing trees.
Okay, thank you. And I know I'm running out of time, but so let me just mention in a briefing from a top NASA official last week, I was surprised. I didn't know our moon's orbit around Earth has been changing slightly. Obviously, that has ramifications for climate and changing. So I would encourage our experts, anything you can do to help us come up with a way to keep our moon's orbit from changing would be helpful. Also, we advise that the ice caps are melting on Mars. So we need to figure out what it is being done on this planet to cause the ice caps to melt on Mars. Our Earth's orbit is changing. That'll affect climate. So anything you can do to change our orbit and keep our orbit where it is would be gratefully appreciated. I yield back.
Chairman yields. Let me now recognize Ms. Leisure Fernandez for 5 minutes. Gentlelady from New Mexico is recognized.
Thank you to the Chair Neguse for holding this and to Chairman Grijalva for stepping in. So my home state is close to Colorado, so we feel the pain. But it's also blessed with an abundance of public lands and beautiful landscapes. And, you know, we are at risk of losing these treasured areas from wildfires, droughts, and other impacts of a changing climate. And so, you know, I do recognize that to protect the places we love, we must take bold climate action. Mr. Sprankle, my first job was actually with the Conservation Corps. So I have a special appreciation for the work that you do, and I support the 7 specific proposals you gave us today. I also served as the Vice Chair on the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation and know it's key to protect the cultural and history of our areas. This weekend, I toured BLM and forest public lands and saw destruction of paleo pictographs, no enforcement anywhere, and no interpretive material for thousands of pictographs and cultural history sites that included 17th to 19th century Hispano and Anglo activities. I'm wondering if we might build an entity within the Corps that's specifically dedicated to protecting historical and cultural sites. So, Ms. Franco, what do you think about creating and increasing funding for a cultural conservation corps that serves not only our important Native American heritage, but also the many other stories that make up our history?
I think it's a wonderful idea, and I think to some extent it's already going on. The Ancestral Lands program that operates in your state is doing some of that on tribal lands already. Kupu in Hawaii has a whole program dedicated to preserving and interpreting the culture of the islands. A number of Corps have been doing historic preservation projects in partnership with the National Trust for Historic Preservation, learning the craft and the history behind the work that they are doing. So the short answer is it is going on in sort of pockets around the country, and I think absolutely it should be funded and increased. And its importance it equals the protection of public lands and other kinds of protective activities.
Thank you, because it would create those kinds of jobs for the different communities that we are talking about, while also, you know, having that long-term view that we're trying to get to. You know, New Mexico, 32% of our general fund tax revenue is generated from oil and natural gas activity and other severances of fossil fuel. So I'm very aware that as we transition to a clean energy future, we must also recognize that these oil and gas communities, the same ones that have fueled our nation growth, may need our assistance. So the title of this hearing is that we need a just transition, as the title states, a prosperous future for all. Dr. Cross, how can we ensure that we don't leave communities like those in my district behind as this necessary transition takes place? How do we make it just and prosperous for all?
Yeah, thank you. I think it is very clear that climate change is impacting already burdened communities the hardest, hitting them the hardest. And it is, I think, a moral obligation for us to channel the resources needed for those communities to better cope with and deal with those impacts. And as I mentioned, I have seen really some of the most significant leadership from some of the indigenous communities in the United States in leading in holistic adaptation planning. And I believe that they offer opportunities to really advance in thinking about climate adaptation, and programs like the BIA Tribal Resilience Program and many other federal programs could be increased to provide even greater support for those communities that need it most.
And are some of those the jobs that we might need for cleanup, for remediation, for capturing methane that's spewing into the atmosphere, you know, are those the kinds of activities that also might use some of the same highly skilled workers that are involved in the fossil fuel industry?
Yeah, I imagine that there can be opportunities to retrain and train people for new jobs in careers that are, again, going to have a better outcome for our environment, as well as creating economic opportunities. And then I also want to echo Mary Ellen's comments about also training and support for youth and young people in our communities to give them the skills that they need to be marketable in a job careers in natural resource management and in climate informed mitigation and adaptation work as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. I yield.
Lady yields. Mr. Lamborn, sir, you're recognized. 5 minutes. Mr. Lamborn. Let me move to.
I'm here.
Oh, Mr. Lamborn, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
No, Sablon. Sablon's here.
Mr. Lamborn, are you recognized for 5? If not, let me still go on the minority side. Mr. Rosedale, sir, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Ranking Member. Thank you both. Like many, I want to share my condolences with Chairman Neguse and the folks from Colorado. We are praying for you all at this difficult time. And a special thank you to Dr. Cross. It's always nice to have someone from Montana participating with us. As an avid outdoorsman, I know how special Montana public lands are and to our way of life. I believe balancing environmentally sensitive areas, expanding public access for recreating, while ensuring responsible development of our natural resources are not mutually exclusive. Conservation and public access do go hand in hand. I'm worried about President Biden's executive orders and the ramifications they will have by killing jobs and limiting access to our public lands. We need to ensure that we look at science and the facts scientific community provides before making rash decisions. Furthermore, the West has seen its most catastrophic wildfire seasons yet. Many of these fires could have been prevented or reduced in scale had proper forest management been in place, which is why I introduced the Forest Information Reform Act to address the cottonwood decisions and cut burdensome red tape and end perpetual cycle of litigation that plagues responsible forest management. This bill provides the Forest Service the flexibility to incorporate new information into their current plans rather than being forced to start from scratch. So now we begin. Governor Little, as seen throughout the West, where fires from improperly managed forests have caused enormous destruction of property, habitat, and loss of life, effective forest management is vital to protecting our forests, nearby communities, and wildlife. The Trump administration proposed a revision to Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act, also known as the Cottonwood Decision, similar to the FUR Act to address reconsultation of new information. Can you discuss the impacts these common sense changes would have on forest management?
Well, Mr. Chairman and Congressman Rosendale, anything we can do, whether it's NEPA, whether it's the Endangered Species Act, whether it's Clean Water Act, whether it's Clean Air Act, particularly those I call them the super laws, to get to the intent of Congress, which is where the public has input, but it doesn't stop progress. It doesn't stop the day-to-day progress of doing forest health, of doing management, of restoring species, of keeping water clean. So many of these things were, the Endangered Species Act and NEPA are two of my favorites. If you go back and look at the debate about those two well-intended pieces of legislation, and then what they've morphed into over the years, poll Americans, ask them the common sense question about, do you think this unintended consequence of an interpretation of a well-intentioned piece of legislation that's in the best interest? What people despise is the inability of government to do what most people believe is the right thing to do. So anything we can do to sweep away some of that legal, bureaucratic, whatever it is, friction to getting the right thing done. We have got to scale up better management to compensate for the footprint that our species leaves on this planet. And there's great agreement to that. We just need to get along with it. And some of these, it looks to me, I might be a little biased from the chair I sit in, some of these minor changes to get that progress done, I think it should be well received. Thank you, Congressman.
Thank you very much. And I think that we can agree that the folks that are closest to these areas should be the ones that are making the most relevant decisions about them. And as Governor Bullock himself stated at the Western Governors Association meeting in 2016, and I quote, "We can't wait for Washington, D.C. when it comes to forest health." And I would have to agree with the governor there. I'm getting ready to get out of my time, Governor Little, but I was privileged to serve on the Sage-Grouse Commission when it was first enacted in Montana and saw an increase of the sage-grouse populations. And what I'm trying to find out now is, can you discuss the impacts landowners will face if the sage-grouse is listed under the Endangered Species Act?
Well, Mr. Chairman and Congressman, the one thing I know about sage-grouse is there's a lot of variabilities for habitat. In Idaho, noxious weeds and wildfires are the biggest enemy. And a, quote, one-size-fits-all solution for fish and wildlife or interior is not what will solve the issues with sage-grouse. Sage-grouse has to be crafted to the landscape and the habitat that it's in today. We've spent countless hours with the conservation community on sage-grouse, and a state solution is better than a federal solution. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Thank you, sir. Let me now, I believe, I'm sorry, Mr. Sablan, I didn't see you returning earlier. Let me recognize Mr. Sablan.
Thank you very much, Chairman. We have, let me also join
Thank you, sir.
many others in expressing condolences to Mr. Neguse, to the Colorado delegation, and to the people of Colorado for their pain to the horrible and devastating mass shooting. I associate myself with Mr. Neguse's statement that Americans should feel safe in their grocery stores, their schools, their movie theaters, and their communities. Ms. Sprinkle, in your testimony, you extolled the many benefits of the Service and Conservation Corps throughout the country, the important restoration efforts, and the bolstering of the outdoor recreation economy. So can you tell me what services the Corps currently provides in the United States territories?
Sure. Actually, a number of our corps, Conservation Legacy, American Conservation Experience, Kupu in Hawaii, are deploying Corps members and crews to the U.S. territories where they're building trails, restoring habitat, increasing access to outdoor recreation, and the same sorts of things, restoring shoreline and fish habitat, the same things that they are doing here on the mainland, they are doing in the territories.
Right. So how can we increase services to both the territories and to other underserved and underrepresented population?
I think the short answer is additional funding, first for project work, but then for Corps member training and development and for program support. All three pieces sort of need to come together to provide a comprehensive experience that leads to a career pathway for a young person.
All right. Okay, this may be going deep into the weeds, but if it's possible, would you provide my office with a name and a contact information for someone in the Marianas who's on the Corps projects, and I could get in touch with them and talk to them some more. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Branco. Dr. Crowles, how important is conserving intact natural areas in meeting the goal of protecting 30% of America's lands and waters by 2030 and other climate goals?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Sablan. So protecting intact ecosystems is really our best defense against a changing climate and stemming the loss of biodiversity. Intact forests around the globe absorb 25% of humanity's global emissions, greenhouse gas emissions each year. And as we know, protecting intact areas that are already intact and functioning well is a lot cheaper than restoring areas once they've been degraded. So it's really the logical first step in trying to, again, stem the losses, address climate change, and it's really cost effective. But as I want to reiterate that we are not talking about achieving 30 by 30 purely by locking lands away in protected areas of a strict level of protection. But this is going to take efforts across all types of lands as well, working lands included.
Okay, so and you also mentioned in your testimony the importance of expanding on existing protected areas to create larger protected ecosystems. So please let us know why this is an important step to take for biodiversity protection.
Yeah, that's right. And I guess I'll say here that it is really important to ensure that our landscapes provide opportunities for plants and animals to seek the climate conditions and habitat conditions that they need to survive as they change with a changing climate. So when I talk about trying to encourage larger landscape protection, it doesn't, again, necessarily mean putting lands away under strict protection, but thinking about the mosaic of public and private lands and how they can serve and provide habitat and functions, corridors, connectivity, opportunities for species to move and track and cope with and adapt to changes in climate. So the larger the landscapes are that species can find habitat within and move around within, the better chances they're going to have in being able to persist in a changing climate. And again, that doesn't necessarily mean putting it all under strict levels of protection, but managing public lands and private lands in ways that are conducive and to what plants and animals need to survive.
All right. Yeah, I have more questions and I will submit them for the records. And I forgot to say good morning to everyone. And when I say good morning, I mean 1:45 in the morning, your tomorrow. But Chairman Grijalva, thank you for stepping in for Chairman Neguse. Are you back?
Thank you, Mr. Sablan, and good morning to you. Thank you for that. Let me now recognize Mr. Moore. Sir, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. And what I'll add with the events in Colorado is it's been tough as a freshman to build bipartisan relationships and build some friendships off the virtual nature and the way that things have been going on. Representative Neguse is somebody that I've been able to do that with, though, to some degree. And I'll just state that the people of Boulder have an incredible representative that cares deeply about them, representing them, and I can already see how hard he's working for them at this very tough time. So So thank you for that. This issue is close to my heart. Utah, as is often stated, is like the second highest percentage of public lands of any state, second to Nevada. In ensuring that our country can get back to a strong economic recovery, a strong recovery in general, public lands is going to need to be a part of that, especially for states with such high public lands as a part of it, getting us back on our feet. So with that in mind, I have just a few questions for Governor Little. Governor Little, you've worked, something I hear a lot from my constituents as well. There's a general perception that using our lands means a little more than abusing the lands. Can you elaborate on how land users actually help us manage our lands in a healthy manner?
Well, Mr. Chairman and Congressman Moore, I know there's a certain percent of the population that believes that, but I mean, you can go outside of any urban area, and I've got a perspective. I'm sitting in Boise, Idaho, and the foothills that are just about 1.5 miles from here. There was a point in time when it was unmanaged, when there was vandalism, garbage dumped. There weren't any trails. There were arbitrary selection of trails. It took a while, a little pressure, but the community came together, and it's real interesting because it's BLM, Forest Service, Army Corps, State of Idaho, and private land, of which I'm one of the private landowners. I used to run sheep on that piece of real estate. I don't think anybody in Boise would disagree that the management that we're doing now on it makes it better for wildlife, better for the watershed, better for everyone. And so the no use versus managed use for a lot of the people of Idaho, particularly people that have been here for a long time, is settled for the most part. Now we have some people, as you do, Congressman, that are moving into Idaho that might have a little different opinion, but it's settled in Idaho.
Excellent. And then the other piece that I'd like to talk on is the concept of the importance of intact forests. The wildfires in the West have emitted millions of metric tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. What do you believe, for the record here, is the best way to protect forests while also reducing carbon emissions related to these wildfires?
Well, Mr. Chairman and Congressman, that's the crux of the issue. We have just got to scale up management in these areas to stop these. I look at the snow report in Idaho every week because the big snowfall means we're going to have high moisture level, and low snowfall means we're susceptible until we get better management to these catastrophic fires. And it's the net of some of these events. Everybody likes to go to a logging site and look at what it looks like right after they log. Very few people go back 5, 10, 15 years and look at what's taken place there. And we know that management, and there's some areas that we've got set aside that are a wilderness area, that's fine, but it's the net off of all of it. And one of the things that I talked about a little bit is shared stewardship, where we take state land, federal land, and private land and incorporate them all together to make sure that that ecosystem is intact, that what you do on your federal ground doesn't impact my state land or private landowners' private land. And that's a lot of the solution, is that shared stewardship model.
Excellent. And mentioning Representative Neguse, I look forward to working with him on the bipartisan wildfire caucus, along with another rep from Utah, John Curtis. The only other remaining question, I'll ask it, we'll be running out of time here, is the effect of the moratorium also potentially on tribal land? The Ute Indian tribe here in Utah, in this area, they rely heavily on the royalties from oil and gas and the energy production. I'd open to any comments on that, but I'll yield back now that my time is up. But as the conversation continues, I think that warrants discussion as well.
Gentleman yields. Let me recognize Ms. Porter. The gentlelady's recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Governor Little, you recently signed a letter opposing a pause on federal oil and gas leasing. At the very top of that letter, you said that fossil fuels are, quote, a job-creating industry that provides good careers and steady paychecks to families in rural areas and small towns, end quote. On average, how many oil and gas jobs does $1 million in investment create?
I have no idea. All I know is those are good paying jobs, and that was a good letter, and I stand by it.
You stand by your letter. Okay. According to, and I agree with you, those are good jobs. But according to a Boston University study from last year, $1 million of investment in oil and gas creates about 9 jobs. And that includes both direct workers, those good paying jobs that you're talking about directly in oil and gas working, but also the indirect jobs, jobs like childcare and additional jobs. But let's compare that. On average, how many jobs does $1 million in investment in environmental conservation and consulting create? Consultants for ecological restoration, environmental reclamation projects. How many jobs result from investing $1 million in restoration or reclamation?
Well, Mr. Chairman and Congressman Porter, I don't want to get in trouble with the consultants. That paying consultants is a good thing, but we're making great progress in this country. Some of my previous questions have alluded to. We can do both. We can.
And Governor Little, I want to commend you for taking that approach. We can do both, and I also want to commend you for your honesty to this committee. You're absolutely right that environmental consulting is also a good job. The average environmental consultant in Idaho makes $70,000 a year. That's a good living, Governor Little. But $1 million invested in restoration or conservation produces about 20 environmental jobs. That's more than double the return on investment in terms of good job creation that we get from oil and gas. Let's do one more. On average, how many forestry support jobs does $1 million in investment create? Fire prevention, pest control, reforesting.
Well, Mr. Chairman, Congresswoman, I've already got myself in trouble with the consultants. Now I'll get myself in trouble with the economists, and that's if you lined all the economists up end to end, it'd be a good thing.
All right, so I appreciated that. So on average, forestry jobs for things like fire prevention, pest control, that creates, for every $1 million we invest, 31 jobs. So let's review. $1 million in oil and gas, 9 good paying jobs, including both direct and indirect. So including jobs like childcare. If we do environmental consulting, excuse me, then we're gonna get more jobs. We're going to get about 20. And if we do forestry support, we're going to get 31 jobs, about 4 times the jobs we get from oil and gas. And you just said, Governor Little, that it doesn't have to be an either or, that we can do both. So, Governor Little, will you send a letter similar to the letter that you sent opposing the pause on federal oil and gas leasing? Will you please send a letter encouraging investments in forestry support and conservation so we can create those good paying jobs too, and many more of them?
Well, Mr. Chairman and Congressman, I have been supporting active management by the Forest Service for a long, long time. That is a
reclaiming my time. Governor Little, will you send a letter to the president with your colleagues similar to the one you sent opposing oil and gas pause? The oil and gas pause. Will you send a similar letter encouraging investment in conservation and forestry? Because we just went over how that will create 2 or 3 times more jobs for the folks in your community and across this country than the same amount invested in oil and gas. Will you send that letter with your colleagues and show leadership on your very point that we can do both?
No.
No, you will not.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. Turning to Ms. Sprinkle, can you tell me a little bit about what you're doing with the CORE network to expand disability access across public lands?
Sure. There are actually a couple of ways that the CORE network is supporting increased access to public lands. The first would be partnering with the federal land management agencies, the state and local, on projects improve accessibility, boardwalks, better trails, multi-sensory trails. The other thing that the core programs are doing is they are running crews of young people with varying abilities. So of young people with wheelchairs who need adaptive equipment to work, or hard of hearing and running ASL crews. And those are very successful too. So both for the project work and for the engagement of core members, we're trying to expand opportunities for people with different abilities.
Thank you. My time has expired, Mr. Chair. I wanted to ask that the letter that I referenced be introduced into the record.
Without objection, Ms. Porter, and thank you. And gentlelady yields. Mr. Obernolte, sir, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I had a question for Dr. Cross. Dr. Cross, you, in your testimony, made reference to something I found very interesting. You were talking about the need to protect intact forests. And this is something that I care very deeply about, because the state that I represent, California, you know, we have a lot of national forest. We have a lot of wilderness area. And my particular district, over 90% of our land is public lands in one part or another. But, you know, we've been talking about this issue of catastrophic wildfire, which is something that we in California feel particularly acutely, because we had the worst year in our state's history for wildfire last year. Over 4 million acres of our state burned. So I wanted to ask about thinning, because this is something that, you know, often gets talked about. And I want to ask about your feelings about how thinning fits into this idea of protecting intact forests.
Yes, thank you, Representative, for that question. I want to make 3 key points. One is that climate is an overarching driver for wildfire risk in our nation's forests. Regardless of past or current land management, forest management, climate is an overarching driver that is increasing rapidly wildfire risk. So we cannot solve this problem purely by thinking about forest management alone. Second, I want to emphasize that we do need to manage fuels on our national forest lands, and we need to enable those actions to take place. I agree with that. However, those actions need to be science-based and tailored to be effective in the forests. Not all forests are the same, and our solutions and our forest fuels management need not be the same in all areas. And lastly, I want to emphasize that timber extraction does not equate to lower fire risk. Managing forests for timber production. However, I think my understanding is that fuels treatments that include prescribed burn are among the most effective. So I think combinations of thinning forests, as you alluded to, in combination with other approaches such as prescribed burn and other science-based approaches that are tailored to the specific forest needs, are indeed very important.
Okay, thank you. I think we completely agree on that. Can I ask you about Congress's recent action to classify an additional 1.5 million acres as wilderness areas? One of the concerns that I had about that is that the BLM's manual for management of wilderness acres says that fuels reduction is only permitted in very rare circumstances. So that basically takes that 1.5 million acres and makes it so that fuels reduction can't be accomplished. So do you think that manual needs to be updated? Do you support this idea of taking more federal lands and putting them into the wilderness category where we can't do fuels reduction?
So I'm not familiar with all the details of that specific situation, so I cannot comment on whether I support that specific action. I would just generally say that we need to be targeted and strategic in where we do fuels management, and to be able to target that to those areas where, of course, there is great risk to human lives and safety and infrastructure. However, carefully managed, naturally ignited fires on wilderness lands are one of the most efficient ways to deal with the buildup of fuels from past fire suppressions. So we need to be thinking strategically and carefully about how we use all these various tools in the most effective, cost-effective, and efficient ways possible.
Oh, okay, thank you. It sounds like we completely agree on that. Yeah, just talking before I move on about this idea of fuels reduction. When I toured the town of Paradise in California, that was completely destroyed by a wildfire 2 years ago, it was incredibly stark to see two areas of forest divided by a road, one of which had had fuels reduction done recently, one at which had not. The one at which had not was burned all the way down to the ground because the fire had gotten up into the crown of the trees. And the one that had fuels reduction, the trees were still healthy, all the underbrush was gone, but the fire was much less severe. And so, that's why I think we need to revisit this issue of fuels reduction in wilderness areas. My last question is for Governor Little. Governor is a fourth generation rancher. I wanted to ask you about fuels reduction too, because one of the strategies that we use for fuel reduction in the West, as you're aware, is grazing. And I wanted to ask, do you think that that's an effective strategy for fuels reduction on federal lands?
Well, Mr. Chairman, Congressman, absolutely. In some cases, there's countries, Canada in particular, uses it aggressively, and so do other areas. But you can just look at the history in the past about fuels. But it's not a panacea. It doesn't work everywhere. But it is one of the most effective tools. And if you look at the great increase in catastrophic fires, if you graph that with the number of AUMs off of the federal estate, there's a direct proportion between the reduction of grazing and the increase in fires, whether it be on rangelands or whether it be on forest lands. But like I said, it's not a panacea, and you've got to manage these grounds. You obviously can't graze them all the time, but range management, the science in range management has evolved logarithmically over the last 50 years. And using proper range management, we can do fuels management.
Well, thank you, Governor. I agree with you on that too, but that ties into another concern that I have about the way that our wilderness areas are managed, because that prohibition against fuels reduction also applies to grazing. And so I think it's taking a valuable tool out of our arsenal for dealing with lowering the risk of catastrophic wildfires. So I want to thank you very much for our panelists. It's been a fascinating discussion. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Gentleman yields. Let me now recognize Representative Harrell. Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a quick question for Ms. Cross. I just want some clarification if you can. I've heard several times during this hearing strict level of protections on both private land and public land. Can you kind of elaborate very quickly? What does that mean specifically as it relates to private land?
I think my reference was instead to say that in some portion of that 30% by 30 will be on strictly protected public lands. However, to meet 30 by 30, we also need to look at the conservation values that are supported on both private and working lands and other forms of managed lands. That was what I intended to say.
Okay, and Mr. Chair and Ms. Cross, so does that mean collaboration and working with private landowners, or is there going to be some sort of mandate or some kind of restriction for the landowner?
Yeah, thank you, Representative, for pointing that out. No, this really needs to be a participatory process. We need to work together to figure out how we can do what's needed to protect nature and our natural life support systems. And we need to involve all the different stakeholders and involved parties in those discussions to collaboratively find ways to get to that solution.
Right. Thank you for that. And Governor Little, I wanted to ask you, in terms of one of the ways our federal lands can help to spur on economic growth, and I know you spoke about this a little bit, but what kind of roadblocks did you overcome or have you dealt with as it relates to energy in your state, and specifically maybe the geothermal resources? I mean, how are you able to overcome that, or are you still working through some of the regulatory process to get through that in order to keep those jobs intact, et cetera?
Well, Chairman and Representative, federal government has no shortage of hurdles, whether it be mining, grazing, logging, and particularly energy development, whether it be wind turbines, solar panels, and of course the big issue is transmission for energy, is to get that energy from the places where we have it, particularly whether it's wind and solar, to the places where we need it. So the permitting of transmission lines is perhaps one of the old Green Deal issues that needs to continue to be addressed, because you can't have proper management of the grid if you can't facilitate transmission from one area to the other, and in fact, even creating micro grids where we have more sustainability in a certain area. But the permitting of transmission is one of the biggest critical issues we have in Idaho.
Right, right. And I appreciate that. And I mean, just the federal lands issue and the federal overreach can be very troubling. And New Mexico is going to be hit very tough with these executive orders. Over half of our energy production comes from federal lands. But I do very quickly want to, I applaud you for saying no to the letter. Comparing jobs created by restoration groups or forest management groups is very different from energy job creators. In fact, the average producer will spend up to $10 million to get those jobs going. So that would really equate into about 90 jobs, which is about 39 more jobs than both the other two industries that my colleague mentioned combined. So thank you for standing strong on your values. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Lady yields. Mr. Westerman had asked for an opportunity to make some closing comments. I'm more than happy to extend that courtesy to the ranking member. And with that, Mr. Westerman, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, thank you to the witnesses. These are conversations that we need to have. And I know there's been a lot of talk about preservation versus conservation in wilderness areas. And, you know, my position is we need to be practicing conservation on all the land, public and private, but it's not necessarily going to be because of a government program. And as we look at wilderness areas, I just want to remind people what the Wilderness Act says. It says wilderness is an area untrammeled by man that is undeveloped and without permanent improvements. In fact, there's an entire provision of the law that decrees there will be no temporary roads, no use of motor vehicles, motorized equipment or motorboats, no landing of aircraft, no other form of mechanical transport, and no structure or installation with any such area. This means no bicycles, strollers, off-highway vehicles, and it means we can't mechanically treat any wilderness areas. There are 7 million acres of wilderness areas that have burned due to catastrophic wildfires in the past 10 years, and that's not all because of climate change. It's because we don't give land managers handsaws and shovels to try to address this issue. Now, if we want to talk about changing what a wilderness area means, I'm open to having that discussion. But if we're talking about locking more land up into wilderness, where essentially you get zero jobs, you get zero economic multiplier because you're not doing any management in a wilderness area and you're doing more damage to our environment than you're doing good. So again, it's unclear what 30 for 30 means, but I know recent actions, there's been land set aside in wilderness areas, there's been mineral withdrawals, and it's a denial of access and management, which I think is ultimately going to be detrimental to the environment, not to mention rural economy. So hopefully we can work together on this to come up with common sense solutions because we desperately need to do conservation. We desperately need to take care of what we've got and leave it in better hands for future generations. And that's how we can truly address environmental and climate issues. So if we're talking about that kind of action, I think you could get a lot of support across the aisle. But if you're talking about truly locking stuff up in wilderness areas, as the definition of wilderness says, then it's going to be hard for us to support that. So, Chairman, I look forward to future conversations and discussions, and I hope we really apply the science. We talk about the science, but I can tell you, show me a wilderness area and I'll managed areas that will blow it away on biodiversity, both plant and animal biodiversity and healthy forests. So open for that anytime. I yield back.
Thank you, sir. And let me now recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Fulcher. You're recognized, sir, to make your comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just briefly, I think We all agree, it seems to me, on wanting a better environment. Where we potentially disagree is what that really means. To me, that's fostering a habitat that's good for wildlife and that it's resistant to catastrophic fire. It's sustainable, renewable resource for generations to come. And if you agree with that, if my colleagues agree with that, we do have good news because we can have it all. And in part, you do that by allowing local stakeholder input, by cleaning up fuel load and minimizing regulations that stagnate that land. And in so doing, you get a win-win. You get a win for the economy, you get a win for the environment. And resource jobs, like my colleague, Representative Harrell pointed out, multiply through the economy many more times than service jobs do. And so those are just part of the thought process that has contributed to the fact that so many people have left Representative Porter's district and they're moving to mine. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
And let me thank the witnesses and my colleagues on the subcommittee for attending this hearing. I thought it was very important. Looking ahead and looking ahead, and I would agree that I think the comments made earlier by my colleagues in the minority, one in particular, talking about the need to have a regular process on this committee to debate and make decisions regarding issues going forward, and I couldn't agree more. And I think this committee has that responsibility, and as such, I welcome that, and I welcome working with Mr. Westerman to expedite that and to make sure we're doing that, but also to assure that we're not delaying anything. That I think we want to become a committee of action, not a committee of non-action. And as such, if that's the understanding, I think we can get a lot done. I want to take this moment to address some of the misinformation we've heard here today, and it'll be repeated over and over. Because despite what some have suggested, protecting land isn't about locking them up. Protecting public lands is about supporting healthy wildlife, preserving those places that Americans love and will visit and will continue to visit. And now, after we come out of this pandemic, we'll visit even more and explore even more. And we also need to acknowledge that merely extraction, whether it's mining, oil, gas, drilling, or clear cutting a forest, is in conservation, no matter how you want to dress it up. And I think we have a responsibility to consider what's in the public interest, not just into what the industry's interest is in particular. And I agree, balance is important. And we've lost some of that balance in Interior and in the jurisdiction that this committee has in the public lands. Those public assets are national assets. And no particular county or state has veto power over the work of this committee and its jurisdiction in doing what's best for a national asset. The federal lands in Arizona and the Grand Canyon is as much Utah's people's asset as it is Arizona's asset. It should be treated that way. And so going forward, I think we'll deal with balance. We'll deal with science-based. I couldn't agree more. That science-based empirical information as the guardrail to guide policy and decision-making on this committee and within the Department of Interior is a must. We lost it, we need to get it back. And, and versus the assumption sometimes that anything we talk about, whether it is the pieces of legislation that were referenced today, whether it's legislation going in the future, the assumption is made almost automatically that these are severe job losses that are going to occur and that severe economic loss. And I think science and empirical information are key to that debate, and I welcome it. With that, let me, in behalf of Chairman Neguse, thank everyone again. Our best wishes to him and to the people of Colorado and prayers. And with that, meeting's adjourned. Thank you.